Hello and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm John Worsey, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers who feature on this series of the Life Solved podcast. To celebrate the start of season 13, and as we record this just a short time before Halloween, we're taking a deep dive into the world of horror, how it reflects our current day concerns and our culture. And what better way to record this episode than by doing it in one of Portsmouth's most spooky buildings, the New Theatre Royal. We'll get to this building's haunted past in a moment, but first I'd like to introduce you to our guest for today, Dr. Rebecca Janicker, a senior lecturer here at the university. Together we are going to explore how horror movies and TV shows have evolved, what they say about the human condition, and we'll even make some recommendations for spooky autumnal viewing. Rebecca, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. So,
Rebecca, before we begin, let's take a moment to appreciate our surroundings. We're here in a dressing room at Portsmouth New Theatre Royal. And as I said, this is one of the most haunted buildings in the city. We have quite a few potential ghostly happenings. Well, hopefully not while we record. So if you feel a ghostly pat on the back out of thin air, that may well be the spectre of Henry Rutley, who reopened the former Landport Hall as the New Theatre Royal back in 1856. He was theatre manager, and he was well known for giving his actors and stagehands a pat on the back, and apparently he still does so many, many years after his death. We also have reports of an actor who used to share the stage, or I say an actor, a ghost who used to share the stage with the actors during their curtain calls. Are you feeling any spooky vibes? Are you unsettled at all, or are you not a believer?
Well, it's always interesting to come into a sort of atmospheric space like this, and I think theatres there's always stories whenever you go to a theatre. There's always that interesting history. So yeah, it's a good place to be for this.
Absolutely. What was it that sparked your interest in the supernatural and that took you down the path of research? I believe your PhD was concerned with haunted houses, right?
That's right, yeah. There isn't a specific moment or instance, really. I think I've always felt a keen interest in those sorts of stories, whether they have the grain of truth or whether they're more fictional. And I'm very interested in ways in which horror kind of gets a response from people. Many people have quite an instinctive draw to it, or equally they may feel quite unsettled by it, and that's an interesting thing to talk about, say, with students when I've taught this. And yeah, for me, they're some of the most kind of entertaining and also thought-provoking stories. I like the way horror kind of works on a bit of a visceral level. You kind of respond to
Yes. What was it about haunted houses that you were looking at in the PhD?
Yeah, the PhD was focused on American literature, popular literature, and I was really interested in the device of the haunted house as a way of engaging with space, because we started our conversation here thinking about haunted spaces, and some places are very kind of atmospheric, all of that history there. And I was really interested in the way the authors in the stories that I wrote about used particular spaces to engage with particular aspects of history, really. So buildings from particular eras, certain types of space, the home, the Grand Hotel, that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Well, perhaps we can start with a bit of a look back at how the horror genre has developed over the years. What can you tell us about the way in which horror has changed through the ages?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. When I was doing the PhD, I spent a lot of time researching the Gothic, which is really the kind of wellspring from a lot of horror fiction now. And Gothic really starts here in Europe. I was focusing particularly on the American variant, but what I was doing was thinking about ways in which Gothic ideas, often they're bound up with spooky spaces, crumbling monasteries, mountainous terrain, the haunted castle, all those sorts of things. How does that work in the New World, which doesn't really have those sorts of things? And often you'll get, spooky places like forests, the wilderness, that sort of thing. So that's where I kind of went initially with my research, and then I started to get into the stories that brought that to life.
What have become the spooky places? What are the spaces that resonate for a modern audience?
Yeah, I think, well, so going back, I mean, you were asking about how Gothic and horror's kind of evolved, the path down which it's gone. People are very familiar with that idea of the Gothic genre as being a little creaky, a little antiquated. You know, we think about those old spooky spaces that may seem less relevant, but as time goes by, the genre has really evolved to do different sorts of things. So Gothic, back kind of in the heyday, sort of the mid to the late 1700s, gives way in the Victorian era to the Victorian ghost story. I'm thinking about ghosts here. And that's a real kind of turn to the domestic. So lots of focus on spooky goings on in more familiar spaces. So it's not out in some fantastic location. It's perhaps down the street or a house like your own. And then the mass media has a real impact on Gothic. So once cinema comes along, some of those novels find their way onto the big screen. And then there's a new emphasis on things like how do things look. Sound comes along. Sound has an impact. What becomes scary isn't just the story and the subject matter, but it's the other experiences as well. And then we kind of get to, say, the mid part of the 20th century, and people focus on different fears. So, for instance, the atomic age and horror that's related to what happens in this age of the nuclear age. When recently people will have seen Oppenheimer, not, of course, a horror film per se, but nonetheless dealing with very real-world issues that have found expression in horror film.
One of the sort of horror creatures, if you like, that seems to have remained pretty constant from the novel through to the early days of film and even up to the present is the vampire. And I think the significance of the vampire has changed a lot over the years. Maybe that's why it's had such longevity. But what could you tell us about how the vampire has evolved?
Yeah, the vampire is an interesting one. I think many people will think of vampires and they'll think of Dracula and various iterations of Dracula that have kind of appeared throughout different kinds of pop culture, and that's a very visual image. And there are other things we associate with Dracula, you know, the costume, the mannerisms, those sorts of things. But a lot of horror has its roots in ancient myth, you know, human experiences that are very old, real world issues to do with disease, to do with anxiety about, you know, what wasting, that kind of thing. And lots of cultures have stories about vampire type creatures. They're often associated with contagion, with beings that are said to prey on the living. So that story of Dracula really kind of taps into lots of older ideas that many people would recognise in different sorts of cultures. It's an interesting one. I mean, Dracula is a figure that speaks very strongly to its time in terms of issues in Victorian England, these anxieties about a threat coming from without society, but also repellent, of course, and a threat that kind of comes into the heart of British Empire and British home and culture. But then, as you say, you know, we have seen that figure take many different forms over the years. And I think a lot of people have had great fun and found much on offer in that figure. So we've seen a few different versions of the vampire through the years. So people will think of things like Hammer horror, their take, very cinematic take on that figure. And moving throughout the 20th century, we've had various kinds of versions of vampires. So, for instance, the Anne Rice vampire, those novels that really kind of nudge at the boundaries, vampires who want to be vampires and love it, vampires who don't want to be vampires and hate it, often kind of reflecting back to us, what does it mean to be human? Ideas about embracing your identity, struggling with it, really come through.
Where do you think that transition stems from the sort of traditional horror where the creature is an enemy, to the more modern take where actually we're sort of sometimes getting inside the life of the creature, whether it's a vampire or a zombie or whatever? There's quite a lot of examples, it seems, particularly in recent years.
I think in many ways lots of people will speak about horror as being quite a conservative genre. So you will have a threat or a monster or something that needs to be kind of overcome. But a lot of those stories, going back quite far, it's not necessarily entirely recent. I think people have become more accustomed to examining those tropes in different ways now. But there are quite a few stories, you go back to some of those early versions of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's monster is in many ways portrayed quite sympathetically. It's just that we are more used now to looking at some of the ideas and considering what's it like to be the monster, not just to experience the monster. I think there's a real appetite now for content, kind of telling all these different stories. But I think lots of those stories are about examining what it means to be different. And the idea of horror as conservative is something that, works up to a point, because we like stories to have resolutions, but there are many different ways of telling some of those stories, and they don't necessarily all tie up at the end. And I think people are really kind of hungry for exploring different perspectives. And the Anne Rice vampires, for instance, are great at doing that, but some of them might still be construed as monstrous.
Yes, I suppose what the meaning of the monsters and how they work changes as well, right? Because vampires now aren't just all necessarily bats and garlic and bloodsucking, are they? There's other sort of I don't know if metaphors is the right way of thinking of it.
Yeah, often vampires and the way in which they're shown tend to say something about who we are. I mean, another text we've had in more recent years, a very TV text, again an adaptation, but something like True Blood explores in quite a graphic way sometimes certain aspects that we might recognise as very traditional Gothic, so Southern Gothic rather, the southern part of the United States really kind of taps into that sort of atmosphere, that being, part of the Gothic experience and in terms of regionalism. But those figures will say something about what it means to live in society, how people relate to other people. Vampires are often a figure of excess, but I mean that poses an interesting sort of a scenario in which vampires are known and they might be able to, should they so choose, partake in society in a way that hasn't been seen perhaps in other sorts of stories.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? So it's such a multifaceted thing. Just if people are hearing spooky banging during Rebecca's answers, don't worry, that's not a ghost. It's the sound of the stage being piped through the speakers here, and I think there may be a haunted aerosol possibly somewhere in the room as well. Some spooky fragrances being pumped out. Is it fair to say that horror stems from something quite primeval, sort of primal human fears of something under the bed or a malevolent force that's hiding in the shadows? Do you think that's what the root of it is?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because a lot of people feel that horror is quite, or potentially quite silly. It's something that there's not much of a place for in contemporary culture, whereas other people feel very strongly that, that is scary and I don't like that and I don't really want to experience that. And I suppose there's another group of people who are a little bit more like, yeah, I can sort of see it, and maybe, it's the suspension of disbelief, but there's kind of a value or a use for being scared. I think many of those ideas that we look to in horror are pretty old, and some of them might feel a little outmoded, but I think there are always moments when we might feel, shall I say, a thrill of fear, even if you consider yourself to be very rational and, not a believer and so forth. I do think things like the possibility of a ghostly presence in an unfamiliar place under the right circumstances is really interesting. I have an oft-quoted quote from H.P. Lovecraft, an early 20th century writer of horror, and I'm probably slightly paraphrasing, but he's saying, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the strongest is the fear of the unknown, and that's something that most people can probably relate to.
Yeah.
It's always possible that there's something out there that we don't know about.
It's quite a useful emotion to have, I suppose, in evolutionary terms. It's we're not here because our ancestors wandered around blithely, not worrying about what was lurking in the forest.
Yeah, arguably it is, as you say, a very strong kind of, instinct that could be very, very helpful in the long run. Yeah.
Do you feel that horror does serve that function of a sort of a reminder? Is the cautionary tale still something that we need, maybe more now in a broadly safer world?
I think there's lots of examples of that, aren't there? Whether it's something that we're sort of talking to children about, you need to be careful, these are the things that you have to watch out for. And, there are many, of course, all too realistic fears that some people confront daily, other people might just read about in the news, and people's lived realities can be dire and pressing. And of course, you only have to look at the news, and this is, throughout the decades and throughout recent days, to see that there are many potentially life-threatening situations. And horror can be a way of kind of experiencing that, whether you're kind of going through something or whether you're not. It is such a part of the human experience. I think it is a way of kind of accessing those emotions.
It's often pilloried as well, isn't it, horror? I mean, there's things like the trope that watching horror will desensitize you to horrific things that are real in the world, or that, the 1980s video nasties craze, where more recently with kind of violent video games, I suppose it's similar, isn't it? This idea that, if you watch horror, then you will do horrible things.
Yeah. See, that's quite a complicated debate. I mean, that's not particularly been the focus of my research. See, my research is focused more on, what's in the stories and what they kind of tell us and how do we relate to them. But certainly as a media kind of researcher, there has been quite a bit of a history of people thinking about those sorts of issues and trying to determine whether or not these are effects, if you like, that could have an impact on audiences. I think the reality is probably pretty complicated because there are so many films that people watch, and of course most people are not going to act upon them or particularly be affected in a very obvious way. It's a complicated part of the human experience, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in a funny way, that's almost people kind of preying on their own fears, isn't it? It's you're never accused of, you only got married because you watched 4 weddings and a funeral, are you? It's always horror films and violent films that get this accusation thrown at them. I
think that's true. I mean, one of the things that I do teach on is film history, and that's a very old debate and anxiety, especially vulnerable groups in society. Younger people watching things, are they going to be influenced? Will they copy things? But yeah, there are realistically many things that make up the human experience, and media is one part of that.
So, kind of expressed very simply, your take on it from your research is that we tell ourselves these stories because we need them in some way, and they help us address the world. And I think there's a really great example of that in the American TV show American Horror Story that's been running for quite a long time now, and has explored so many different horror themes and horror tropes and done really interesting things with them. And one of the things it does a lot is speak to really kind of pressing modern issues in the culture. So it's touched on politics, it's touched on race, gender, sexuality. Do you think horror is particularly suited as a genre to us unpacking the issues of the time?
Yeah, I do think so. It's an interesting one because American Horror Story is a great example for me, because I've been teaching horror, particularly on TV, since that is indeed a TV show, for a good sort of 10 years plus. Going back a few years, there were fewer examples, but over the last sort of 10, 15 years, there's been such a proliferation, which, there's an appetite for content, and streaming has meant there are so many, different sorts of audiences, and audiences with different tastes are being catered to. But there clearly is a big appetite for horror at the moment, and a lot of that is very focused in its own particular way, more atmospheric, more gory, on issues that people kind of recognise and relate to. American Horror Story, as you say, it started in 2011. It's been going for a decade plus. It appears roundabout now every year, yes. So spooky season, and it quickly became associated with the strong female characters, often older characters, different sorts of experiences among the cast, and really trying to explore, often for me very focused on a space, which I found interesting. So the first one became known as Murder House. Then we've had, hotel, Roanoke, some of these are very location oriented. And yeah, absolutely getting into those issues. And I think a lot of people watching have looked to the show as a way of engaging with things they hadn't necessarily seen portrayed in that way before.
So a lot of those TV shows and films that we're seeing now are actually, they've got their roots in other formats, more modern formats. So rather than novels, now we're seeing comic book adaptations like The Walking Dead, even computer game adaptations, the Resident Evil movies, The Last of Us, which has been a huge hit on TV in the last year. How does the original DNA of something like a comic book or a computer game translate into something on screen?
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting question. For me, Gothic and then horror kind of coming from that has always been quite multimodal, we might say. There's always been, going back to Gothic novels and Gothic plays, there's been art, there's been the stage adaptation, there's been the quest to provide special effects, some of which we may be feeling the kind of atmosphere of in this very building. There's always been that kind of drive to offer different sorts of experiences. And there's always been quite a few different adaptations of lots of those classic horror tales. And it's interesting to me how something works in a movie compared to how it works on TV. Sometimes that's meant quite traditional things like you need to censor more for TV. So, Stephen King talks about this, how the cinematic experience is probably going to favour some of his works better than the small screen because the censors worry more on the telly. But TV has plenty of strengths, with it being episodic. Now we're seeing so many stories that are played out over quite a few hours. Sometimes that's a great thing, sometimes it's not so effective. In many ways, I think the short form is pretty good for horror because suspense builds and then, you have that big payoff within a movie. But yeah, as you say, there are lots of examples of horror coming from different areas, like comics, for instance, or from video games, or kind of equally starting out in a format like film and TV, and then here's the game, here's how you can experience the nail-biting terror of being stalked by zombies, for instance, on your way home from work. I know there's an app, yeah. So it's there's lots to enjoy, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. The movies seem to be trending longer and longer, don't they? In general, and you do get horror movies that break the 2-hour mark, but as a rule, you're more likely to find a sub 90-minute horror, aren't you? Why do you think that is?
Possibly. I mean, I do kind of feel for myself when it comes to fiction, although I will contradict myself because many of the horror things that I think work really well, horror texts that work really well. So, for instance, King, Rice, some of their novels are very long, but there is much to enjoy apart from outright horror. The characters and the milieu in which they're set is great. But often, the stories like Lovecraft and Poe, very short stories, work really well. You're kind of immersed. You're not in that environment for too long. The payoff is quick. And another, thing we've seen in recent years in terms of horror cinema, things like so-called elevated horror, bit of a contentious term, but then we might get longer films. We think about things like Midsommar and Hereditary, and some of those films do tend to be a little longer.
A lot of people say that horror is too much for kids. They won't let children engage with horror. There's this kind of assumption that horror will be X-rated in some way, but actually that's not true, is it? There's in the last year we've seen Wednesday on Netflix, based on the Addams Family, which itself I guess is a family-friendly show back in the day, and there's a lot of horror-friendly. Or kid-friendly horror, rather. That's a very different prospect, horror-friendly kids.
Yeah, I think, no, it's a really valid point. And I think, as you say, there's often an anxiety, and I've talked a little bit about censorship and some of those concerns. But, of course, most people will reflect that a lot of fare that is considered to be for children, we think about things like fairy tales. And, of course, monsters and scary scenarios are a big part of that. Often the feeling is perhaps they're fantastic, so that's less concerning, or it's just on the page, so maybe it's less confronting, those sorts of things. But often those stories will be about, a learning experience or dealing with real life emotions in a sort of fun way that you can engage with and then put to one side, share with mum and dad kind of thing. And yeah, there are some really interesting media examples. I mean, Addams Family, absolutely. Wednesday's clearly been such a kind of hit. That's amazing. And we've had different versions of the Addams Family, big screen animated TV. And the Munsters is another one that I think occasionally appears on TV. Doesn't seem to get quite as much love as the Addams Family, but that's also an engaging and very safe kind of take on those sorts of things. And there's other, there's things like Monster House and Monsters Inc. and there's animations that really do engage with those ideas. And yeah, they're looking at things that played differently can be very disturbing, but they're kind of taking those ideas and trying them out and having some fun with them. Yeah, that's got to be more family friendly, I think.
Now the nights are drawing in. And this Life Solved Short is drawing to a close, but before we go, this is a perfect time of year to draw the curtains, put the fire on and sit down and scare yourself in a safe and controlled way with a horror movie. We might have people watching who are real horror buffs and want to discover something lesser known or overlooked. We might have people who are just suddenly curious now as a result of the conversation and thinking, I want to try some good horror. Could you give us a top 3 recommendations, or if not a top 3, just 3 that occur to you in the moment that are, perhaps lesser known, overlooked horror movies, and if possible, if we could get a family-friendly list as well as a full fat horror list, that would be fantastic.
It's interesting because as soon as you start to think of these things, I can imagine people thinking, I knew that one already. But for me, I think things that come to mind, one that I found very effective as a first time viewing but kind of engaging again, was The Descent, which is a few years old now, and it's about a group of female friends that go kind of caving, exploring within the bowels of the mountain, and that is such an atmospheric piece. If you're someone like me who's maybe a little bit claustrophobic, if you're not comfortable with the dark and you're wondering what's going to be lurking there, well, I won't give anything away, but it's not fun. And that is, a fantastic film. Yeah, admittedly, I was thinking that's a good one to watch in a cinema, which isn't always within people's control. But, as you say, nights are drawing in, draw the curtains, lights off, and you can be, in that space with them. Yeah. So The Descent is an interesting one. I do enjoy Sam Raimi's Drag Me to Hell, which is a rather different sort of a text. I remember again seeing that in a cinema and lots of kind of screaming and shrieking, which is kind of fun because horror can be very communal. People will respond, but that's got an engaging story and it's got some interesting characters and it's pretty schlocky, so it's kind of it's got those moments.
It's a lot funnier than it sounds from the title.
Yes, I know. It doesn't sound that well. Admittedly, there are some dark twists and turns, but it is, yes, and indeed, horror and comedy. And not that to say that it is a horror comedy, but there are those kind of aspects of that viewing experience that are not a million miles apart. And another one for me is Colour Out of Space. I don't know if that's a familiar one, but it's...
Is that Nicolas Cage?
Yes, yeah. Nicolas Cage. That's something that I kind of turn to with my studies because it's a reimagining of it is an adaptation really of a Lovecraft story. It's a different sort of experience. It's kind of designed to get you thinking about what's out there. It has a cosmic horror feel, and I've really tried to engage with that cinematically. And Nicolas Cage is
How about family friendly viewing?
Family friendly, yeah, interesting. I would always say Addams Family. I have enjoyed the new Addams Family animated. There's the film, and there's been a sequel to the film, and they're always fun. I think Monster House is good. I think people do, Tim Burton is always engaging. A Nightmare Before Christmas, which I think may be celebrating an anniversary, so that's a nice kind of a way into some of those ideas, and lots to enjoy there, I think. And we did have a bit of a talk, didn't we, about Gremlins? And yes. Potentially, that came into my head. Yeah, what do you think? Family friendly?
I'd say so, yeah. Yeah.
Depends on the family. Yeah.
Yes, it does, yes. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for your recommendations and thank you for your time as well. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I think we've seen that there's obviously nothing wrong with just enjoying a horror film in and of itself. Now, if you'd like to listen to our full spooky episode of Life Solved on horror, you can head to the University of Portsmouth website or to your favourite podcast app and download it. You can also find out how to support research like Rebecca's on the Life Solved page, which is linked to in the episode description. Or head to port.ac.uk to discover how you could perhaps work with or study with us.